So today we have a special guest. We have Doc, as mentioned before. He's a Navy corpsman, and I'm very glad to have you here. Doc, could you give a short introduction of yourself?
Yes, and thank you for having me. I was a corpsman for a little over 20 years. I loved my service. I have two children. I was married for a little over 20 years now.
So let's start off with the triage process. There were several questions about the whole triage process, although I'm not sure if this is the correct term. Hence, you could give us a short overview about the whole process that is involved when a serviceman is wounded in combat, for instance, initial treatment, the extraction, and further treatment. So basically all the important steps and maybe some important names.
So the triage process is always the same. There is a difference between the military and the civilian triage. I was a paramedic for 12 years, so I was very intimate with both of the processes. In the military, the always starts with return fire. First step is always return fire. Only through fire superiority are you going to be able to help that casualty. The next step is to ascertain whether or not that casualty is responsive or unresponsive. In other words, can they get themselves to cover, or are we going to have to get them to cover? Or is there any reason to worry about them until after the firefight at all? In other words, are they already deceased? In which case, we will recover their body, but we don't need to risk anyone during the firefight to get them out of harm's way. And that can be a little difficult because from a distance, you have to figure out if you can go get that person or not. I typically erred on the side of, unless it was grossly obvious that they were no longer alive, that we were going to go get that person. Most of the time, they are conscious and they can get themselves to cover, and therefore we can move the firefight into a stage where we can get someone around to them to get them into better cover or whatever. In other words, when the bullets are immediately flying, I'm not going to do any treating. Secondly, once we can get to them or the firefight is moved beyond or to a different place, then the next step is for me to determine whether or not they have any life-threatening bleeding going on. Typically, that's going to be some kind of bright blood jetting out the first few times. After that, it's pulsing, their clothes covered in blood, blood pooling underneath them, things like that. Some wounds can look very nasty, like some that we treated were forearm, upper leg. They took a lot of meat out, but it's not life-threatening because no large arteries or large veins were part of the casualty. If it's life-threatening, got to get a tourniquet on it. One of the things that in the early 90s was discouraged was tourniquets. We were taught that if you put a tourniquet on, that's where the surgeon was going to cut that limb off.
What exactly is a tourniquet?
A tourniquet is some type of device that you're using to stop the flow of blood. You use them on extremities, and there are a couple of junctional type of tourniquets that can go across the main body itself, the trunk of the body, to help stem the flow of blood to the extremities, especially the lower extremities. And the tourniquets we have now are a lot better. In the early 90s, the tourniquets were a green strap, cotton/nylon strap that you just tightened down until the blood stopped. A lot of times you had to get a stick or something metal and twist inside of it to try and get it tight enough, because depending on the person, there's a lot of flesh between them and the artery you're trying to staunch the flow of blood from. Nowadays, they're very easy to get on. All the Marines I was with always had at least one. I typically carried about 4, but everyone I was with, officer enlisted, frontline, rear, it didn't matter who you were. If I was with you, you had your own tourniquet. and I taught them how to put their tourniquets on, one-handed on their arm or leg. And they're a lot quicker to put on, and they can be done in even impaired within about 30 seconds. So, life-threatening bleeding, you got to stop that first. And just because the wound looks bad doesn't mean it's life-threatening. Then after that, you do a quick primary assessment. Is there anything else? I see the one wound, is here. Did the bullet come out someplace? Did it take a big chunk of meat out someplace? Did it involve any other primary organs or arteries between where it entered and where it exited? And then you have to treat that area as well.
Is there, for instance, other cases of psychological, I don't know how I call it, breakdown, or the panic or some other stuff? Is this also part of the process?
Well, their emotional state and things like that does come in later. The primary part, there is no difference. It's all the same. It doesn't matter what their emotional state is, just their responsive state. Are they alert enough to follow directions if I give them directions? Later, it becomes an issue. People deal with injury to their body in many different ways, and media has helped and hindered a little with that. For the majority of the time, you can tell they're in pain, but they're not writhing in pain. They're not screaming. The initial shock of the injury typically leaves you quiet, and then as the pain sets in, the emotion changes. Going back to the triage, after your primary assessment, then you've got to decide if this patient is somebody that needs to get out of there quickly. The majority of patients who die end up dying before they get to definitive care or a treatment facility. That's true in the civilian and the military world. So in the early 90s, it was very difficult and ponderous to get a medevac unit to you to get this patient out of there quickly. After the 2000s, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was much easier. A lot of times they had their own radio nets. So we didn't even have to communicate through other channels to finally get word to the medevac of where they need to be and when they need to be there, and where was the safest place for them to land. In Afghanistan and Iraq, they had separate nets. I usually had my own radio man with me. I knew how to call in on the net if the radio man was one of the casualties or injured. I taught all my corpsmen how to do that as well. That's part of the training, both stateside as well as when you get in theater.
So a little technical question on that part. Was this secondary radio net technological changes? For instance, was it more easy to do, or was this mainly an organizational change?
Yeah, it's a little of both. In the early 90s, they didn't have the encrypted radio devices nearly as much as by the 2000s they did. So it was a little bit technology, but mostly it was an organizational change.
I think probably one of the most underestimated equipment in military history by outsiders is radio, because it's changed in Second World War and now again here in medical treatment. It's quite interesting to see this again and again.
Correct. Well, I can't remember a study. There was a study on communication being one of the biggest advantages or disadvantages, be it military or civilian, any type of disaster, how people communicate, who they communicate to, and how many different levels of organization do you have to communicate through to get to what it is you need.
I think we were at the medevac process.
Correct. And then when they arrive on scene, when they arrive in your area, they start communicating locally with you. And by then, the Marines have set up a designated area for them, and they pop smoke so they can see the wind direction, so they land into the wind. And then we move the casualties to the medevac. And depending on the level of medevac that you get, in the old days, you typically got a UH-1 or an H-60 that had typically 3 crewmen. That was a pilot, a co-pilot, and a flight engineer. It didn't make a lot of sense to me because I'm putting injured people onto a vehicle that the people in it, other than basic first aid, have no idea how to care for. by Afghanistan and Iraq. They always came with a corpsman. Sometimes the Air Force would get involved with their pararescue because those guys are paramedic and advanced trauma life support trained. And so it became very easy to hand off a patient because they could see all the devices. They knew the type of injuries and they knew the interventions they were going to have to use to get that patient to definitive care.
So basically you don't have to brief anyone or give them important instructions before they took off. You just handed them over and say, okay, you know what to do.
Right. The instructions became very short. You could just tell them where your junctional devices or tourniquets were, make sure they knew where they were, what the major injuries were, and any problems you saw in the very short future. Like if it was a chest wound, they'd need to keep checking for hemopneumothoraxes, or if you'd put in 18 gauge needles to relieve, decompress a lung, then where you put those and things like that.
So, and medevac is usually done with helicopter, or is it also with armored personnel carriers? What is common?
We trained with armored personnel carriers and Jeeps, the Humvees that had been converted into ambulances. But when you went to 29 Palms, you would train almost primarily with medevac because they were going to be able to get there quicker. Even if you had an ambulance as part of your convoy, you could be hours away from that definitive care where the helicopter is suddenly minutes away from that definitive care.
I think the irony of, can you hear the helicopter in the background
I was going
now?
to say, I heard the helicopter in the background. So the original question was, the triage process. That is pretty much it from conception or the injury to definitive care. Has it changed? Quite a bit, and at the same time, it's remained the same. In the civilian world, the people that are injured the most get the immediate care. In the military world, the people that have the least amount needed typically will get looked at first, but the majority of your time is spent on the ones that have the life-threatening injuries. In a mass casualty situation, everything changes again. The worse off you are, the more expected you are to pass or to die, is the one that the corpsman can treat the least amount of the time, because the other injuries can be treated quickly and you can therefore get to a lot more people, whereas the life-threatening injuries take a lot of your time and therefore more people eventually could die from what wasn't a life-threatening injury that turns into a life-threatening injury.
For instance, if there's is it possible that, for instance, somebody is lightly wounded and he can stay in the fight? Do you make the decision, or will he make the decision? Or is it, if he's wounded, he will get out of the fight? What is the policy, or what is common in this regard?
Well, the corpsman always makes the call whether someone is extracted or medevaced. For the most part, Marines always want to stay with their comrades. So there were times where people's fingers had been taken off, and you find the finger, and a lot of times you can't put it on ice, but I always have Ziplocs with me, throw it in a Ziploc, and they want to stay because it wasn't, it was like a ring finger or a middle finger. They can still function, they can still fight, but no, actually, you're degraded. If I can get you out, I'm going to get you out. If we have enough people to continue the mission, I'm going to get you out. If you're integral to the mission, then you're probably going to stay.
One related question in this way: is it difficult to calm wounded men, or are you usually quite calm anyway? And is this your responsibility or those of others?
It's my responsibility. I would often enlist others to help them. Well, they're less likely to become hysterical because they're professionals and they've had a lot of training on what it is they're doing. I don't recall a time where I was worried about someone's cries to give away a position or anything like that. I'm sure it's happened. It was very important to keep the casualty quiet. I was never in a situation like that. I also was never in a situation to where the casualty was hysterical, but their friends would come and check on them. Sometimes I'd have them stay, depending on what I was doing with the patient. Also, if the patient was very expectant, typically tried to get their better friends, if they were emotionally stable, to be with them for their last moments. One of the issues of being a corpsman with Marines is when you're a young corpsman, you're very involved with the Marines. They're your friends, they're your buds, their families. You wrestle with them. With young people, that's colloquialism that I've never really understood, is wanting to wrestle with somebody, but whatever, that's what they do. And as you become an older corpsman, you still know your Marines and you know their families. And I always told their families, I will, if I'm coming home, they're coming home. I just never promised it would necessarily be alive, but I was going to make sure that they came home. But while you're eating, while you're not really off duty, while you're not on a patrol or convoy duty or something like that, I didn't spend a lot of time with, because emotionally you end up kind of walling yourself off. It's a lot like ER workers in very busy ERs. Two ERs I trained in was Houston and LA County. And you see it a lot with the people that work there. I mean, they care about the casualty. They're wanting to do everything they can to make sure the casualty lives. However, they're not really emotionally involved with the casualty because they have to keep their emotions out of it and stay clear headed for the thinking that required them to do. And you see that with a lot of corpsmen as well. They're standoffish. Like if we were in a field environment and we're eating, I can see all the Marines, but I'm not sitting with the Marines. I'm always removed from them. It's not like you're a watchdog over them as much as if anything happens, you want to be in a position to where you can see it and deal with it and go into action immediately, while other people may just still be standing around, with blood on their face, trying to figure out what just happened.
So basically a professional distance in order to provide the best service you can.
Right. And even though I know the Marine, the way I'm talking to them and treating them is almost like I would do a stranger,
Yeah, makes sense. So basically the people that get wounded in combat and freak out is quite uncommon and is more something we know from Hollywood.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, that's very important because for me that was something completely new.
In fact, sometimes, well, I can't say sometimes, very rarely, were there instances where the casualty thought that they were more grievously injured than I did. And they just wanted the pain to stop, which pain management is a process, but they wanted it to stop in a more definitive and final way. And I would not do that for them because I was going to get them to definitive care. They were going to get home to their families.
Okay, so basically they assumed they were mutilated or something, and yeah, okay, understandable.
Yes, and at least on one occasion, I knew that their quality of life was going to be very poor. But you know, it's a question of perspective. From my perspective, their quality of life is going to be poor. From their perspective, their quality of life is going to be non-existent. However, from their loved one's perspective, either be that a mom or a significant other or whatever, they could care less what their quality of life is. They want to be able to see them and talk to them and express their love for that person at least one more time. So quality of life, they could care less about. So there's a lot of things that happen at the time. You can see their train of thought. However, I'm not going to be a passenger on that train. I'm going to take it somewhere else.